Good evening, everybody. I'd like to join with our co-sponsors at the Valley of the Sun Jewish Community Center in welcoming everyone for this third and final installment of our In Search of Ancient Israel series with Professor Gary Rendsburg. Tonight we'll be searching for the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. I'm Stanley Mervis, Director of Jewish Studies at ASU and the Harold and Jean Grossman Chair of Jewish Studies. The Center for Jewish Studies at ASU is committed to disseminating credible knowledge and fostering a culture of good faith discourse about Jews, Judaism, and the Jewish experience for our students, our faculty, the greater Phoenix community, and as widely as possible. Before I introduce Professor Gary Rendsburg, I'd like to remind everyone that there is no need for reminders anymore because this is the last one. So we've made it through to the end. I will remind you, however, that this program is being recorded and will be available 1 week after after tonight's lecture on our YouTube channel. And please, all questions should go into the Q&A box. We'll stop about halfway through to take questions, and then we'll take questions again at the end. Professor Gary Rendsburg serves as the Blanche and Irving Laurie Chair in Jewish History and holds the rank of Distinguished Professor in the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey. His teaching and research focus on all things ancient Israel, primarily language and literature, though also history and archaeology. His secondary interests include ancient Egypt, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Hebrew manuscript tradition. Professor Rendsburg is the author of 7 books and more than 200 articles. His most recent book is How the Bible is Written from Hendrickson Press in 2019, with particular attention to the use of language to create literature. In addition, he has produced 2 series for the Great Courses program, one on the Book of Genesis and one on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Plus, he lectures regularly for the Smithsonian Associates, One Day University, Context Travel, the Biblical Archaeology Society, and other adult education venues. Professor Rendsburg has visited all the major archaeological sites of Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, plus he has excavated at Tel Dor and Caesarea. He also has done extensive research on medieval Hebrew manuscripts at leading libraries, including the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the Cambridge University Library, the Vatican Library, and the Library of Congress in Washington. During his career, Professor Rendsburg has served as visiting professor or visiting research scholar at the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, the University of Sydney, the Hebrew University, Bar-Ilan University, the University of Pennsylvania, UCLA, the Getty Villa, and the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. At present, he is at work on 2 major projects, a commentary in the book of Samuel for the JPS Bible Commentary Series, and a new dictionary of the Ugaritic language. Please, Professor Rendsburg.
Thank you, Stan, and good evening, everyone. Wonderful to be back together on this Wednesday evening, our third and final installment. And as Stan said when he introduced me, we are this evening going to search for the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Just to remind you where we've been the last 2 weeks and where we are this evening as we move forward. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about earliest Israel, Israelite origins. We went back to the earliest books of the Bible, Genesis and Exodus, to try to reconstruct, and Joshua, to try to reconstruct what we could know. And then last week, we did the united monarchy of David and Solomon. Today, we move forward chronologically in search of Israel and Judah from the late 10th century down to the early 6th century B.C.E. And I'm giving you this little review of what we've done and what we will do this evening for the following reason. The more we advance chronologically in the history of ancient Israel, the more information we have. When we looked 2 weeks ago at Israelite origins, we actually only saw the word Israel once in the Merneptah stele. And all the other material we presented from Egypt and from archaeological excavations and so on never mentions Israel per se. We have to piece it all together. Last week, when we looked at David and Solomon, actually we didn't see much either contemporary with them, no mentions of Israel or David or Solomon. All we get, again, is archaeological material, although from a century later, we got the Tel Dan inscription and the Mesha inscription, both of which mention Judah as the house of David, and we'll return to that this evening. That stands in contrast to what we're doing now, which is a plethora of material where Israel and Judah are mentioned repeatedly in sources from nearby, such as Aramaic and Moabite sources, and from further away, especially Assyrian, and as we'll see, also Babylonian material. If it helps you, consider, as an analogy, the 1,000-year history or 1,000-plus-year history of Great Britain. If we go back to the Old English period prior to 1066, our sources are limited. When we move into the Middle English period after the conquest of William the Conqueror, we get more and more material. And of course, once we move into the modern period, we have so much material, one can't handle it all. One can't be a specialist in all of early modern and modern British history. So if that helps you, the closer we come in time, now of course in the case of Britain we bring it up to the 20th and 21st century, but the closer we come in time, just the more documentation we have. That's what you're going to see this evening, a tremendous amount of material related to the history of, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my laser pointer up and something has gone awry here. I don't want any of this. Okay, I'm not sure. I'll just go with the mouse. Okay, I apologize for that. Okay, so with that as an introduction, let's proceed. Now, we alluded to this at the end of last week. With the death of King Solomon, the kingdom splits into two, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And I will use these two maps, the one on the left giving you political boundaries and the one on the right, a more topographical map, although it shows you the shading of Israel and Judah as well. And this is my handy chart to give you the contrast, the comparisons and the contrast of the two kingdoms. So I've intentionally, of course, put Israel on the upper row and Judah on the lower row because Israel's in the north and Judah's in the south. And you can use these this chart as a handy-dandy quick look at the history of the two kingdoms. So, very quickly, the kingdom of Israel is comprised of 9 tribes. Its capital was in Samaria. There's an asterisk for that, as we'll see. There were 2 temple sites at Dan and Bethel, and it existed for slightly more than 200 years, from its establishment in 930 BCE, the approximate date of the death of Solomon. It lasts down to 721 BCE when it was conquered by Assyria. The north is the kingdom which broke away from the Davidic Solomonic dynasty. Judah, by contrast, in the south is a smaller entity of 3 tribes. The capital remains in Jerusalem. The temple site is Jerusalem. In 930, the temple built by Solomon would still have been new, and it lasts down to 586 BCE when it's destroyed by the Babylonians. And that kingdom was ruled by the descendants of David and Solomon down to the very end. 16 generations of individual kings descended from David and Solomon down to the last one, Zedekiah, on the throne in 586. Just as an FYI, that is the second longest attested dynasty in the ancient world. The longest one is actually an Assyrian dynasty, which will play a part of what we're discussing this evening. So this is a very stable kingdom from 930 down to 586. Or if you start with David in 1000, we're talking about a 415-year period of a single royal family, usually father to son, occasionally a brother or an uncle or something like that. But that's that's a very long period for a single royal family to be on the throne, which is to say it has greater continuity than any of the Egyptian dynasties, for example, none of which lasted 415 years of the 30 Egyptian dynasties, which is how we reckon with the history of ancient Egypt. And by contrast, going back to the north, there were dynasties that came and went constantly. Some of them only 1 or 2 generations. You can't even call them a dynasty. The longest one only lasts 4 generations during that 200-plus year period. So a very difficult time in the Kingdom of Israel, foreign invaders aside, with one royal family or one pretender to the throne usurping the throne, killing the prior king, and so on. We know all of this because, as I say here in the bottom text box, the Book of Kings gives us such great detailed information. From the death of Solomon to the very end of 2 Kings 25, we know the name of every king, how many years the king reigned, in the case of some of them, the names of their wives. This is something we don't have for earlier biblical history, and the chronology is accurate. We're told when it says how many years the king reigned, it's not like you get with Moses 40-year periods, or in the book of Judges 40-year periods, or even David and Solomon, who we are told reigned 40 years each. We get things like this king ruled for 18 years, and this king ruled for 5 years, and this king ruled for 21 years. Very accurate chronology and the overlapping so that we can know who was contemporary with whom in the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Now, here's the map again showing Jerusalem, the capital in the south, established by David, continued by Solomon, and for the next 400 years by those kings. And in the north, the first capital is actually Shechem, although it then moved to a place called Tirzah, not on our map, just for a very short time, and then to Samaria, a newly built city by King Omri, one of the kings of the 9th century B.C.E. And we'll look at the archaeology of those two sites. So first, Shechem. Shechem is attested in the earlier biblical period. It is nestled between the two mountains of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, which you see here. All of this is mentioned in the Bible. Today, it's a relatively big city. Its contemporary name in Arabic is Nablus, but in biblical times, it's Shechem. And right down in the saddle between the two mountains is where the ancient city was, and it has been excavated by various excavations throughout the 20th century. But as I said, more importantly for our story today, the capital moved in the 9th century to the newly built city of Samaria. And in fact, the word Samaria, Hebrew Shomron, is used not only for the name of the city, but is sometimes used by extension for the entire northern kingdom of Israel, and in fact, the whole region there of the northern part of the central hill country. This is called Ahab's palace. It might have been built by his father Omri, who built the city. It could be built by Ahab a generation later. Again, a site that's been well excavated over the years, especially in the 20th century. So that's the capital city. Now, on the left, I've indicated where the two temple sites are according to the Book of Kings, and they are located in Dan and Bethel. Again, both of those sites have been excavated. Bethel was excavated by the famous W.F. Albright of Johns Hopkins University during the 20th century. Some scholars have returned there in more recent years. And Dan has been an ongoing excavation, especially by Hebrew Union College, started by Abraham Biran, and by his successors. It's still going on now for decades. The excavation at Bethel turned up really nothing. I mean, there's material to be seen there, but there's no temple to be found. Archaeology is frequently random. It's what you find is what you find, and we can never know why we might find something here and not something there. So there's nothing to be showing you at Bethel. But if we go to the far north and we go to Tel Dan, one of the two religious centers of the Kingdom of Israel, there is quite a bit to see. This map actually shows you the 3 stars for Shechem, Tirzah, and Samaria smack in the center of the northern Kingdom of Israel. By the way, note that the northern Kingdom of Israel includes the 2.5 tribes east of the Jordan River. Judah is all west of the Dead Sea, as you see on the map. And it's also important to point out, as I can do now with this map, that the southern half of Judah is all desert. Beersheba south is all the Negev desert. If anyone's ever been there, you know it's just empty terrain. So we assume Judah controlled some of that region to the south, but it's essentially a very small area, which you see right here. Let's see if I bring up there we go. I can bring up my laser pointer now. Okay, so this gives you a sense. This is the arable part of Judah, a much smaller kingdom. Essentially, the entire northern kingdom is arable land. So you get a sense of the 9 tribes in the north versus the 3 tribes in the south, which, by the way, are Benjamin, a sliver of land just north of Jerusalem, Judah, and Simeon down in that very arid region to the south. So let's go to Tel Dan because there's so much to see there. First of all, if we were all together in real time, well, we are in real time, in real space, I would say, raise your hand if you've been to Tel Dan. It's one of the most beautiful sites in Israel. Plush, it's one of the sources of the Jordan River. This is the Dan stream. And if we go to the excavations, now we are looking at the product of 40 years of excavation. This is the city gate looking in. So it's paved, not what you and I would call pavement, but these kind of cobbles, quite rough. It is paved on the outside of the city gate as people would approach. And then there would have been here a set of interlocking double doors with a bar on the inside to lock it. So this is the city gate as we go into Tel Dan, and now we're going right in. This is the threshold where the gate, the wooden doors would have been. And you see here an elevated platform where we believe that the city governor would have held court because you have a little bit of an open space right there at the city gate. And in fact, the biblical texts frequently refer to justice at the city gate. This would have been the place where you could have had a gathering of people. The book of Ruth is set in Bethlehem, but that's a good example of where the elders gather at the city gate to adjudicate a legal case. The altar platform has been found. Biran said it's not from the 10th century, and we can usually date these things based on other objects and remains that are in the area, but rather from the 9th century. So it is not the original altar site described in the Book of Kings, but rather probably an expanded, rebuilt one. Now, in the early years of my visits to Tel Dan, this is what it's looked like. In repeat visits, if you go there now, they have put on top of the altar site the reconstructed altar with this metal frame, including those items in the four corners, what are called the horns of the altar in biblical tradition. So this is an imagined sense of where there would have been an altar whose stones are no longer there on top of the altar platform. The city walls are immense. No city in Israel has city walls this high that are still in situ and present to that height. Look at the tree on the right. But to give you a better sense, look at me standing in front of those city walls. Just remarkable for anyone who's ever walked around or in the city walls or gone in the city gate and go into the city walls from the other side. So there is a snapshot again of Dan, nothing to show from Bethel, and Samaria as as we return to this slide here with that information. Now, we discussed this last week. We discussed the Tel Dan inscription last week because the king of Aram, known as Hazael, ruling from Damascus, refers to the fact that he defeated both Israel and Judah in battle, but that Israel is called Israel, but that Judah is called the house of David, which is highlighted there in the white on the bottom right. We know this battle from the Bible. I'm now going into more detail because last week our interest was just in the use of the word house of David. But now we're in the 9th century, a century after David, a century after Solomon almost, and I want to provide you with some further background information what this very important inscription is telling us. So there again is the line drawing with the Hebrew letters Bet, Yud, Taf, Daled Vav Daled, Beit David, house of David. Here's a translation of it. Now, welcome to the world of reading ancient inscriptions. As you can see, the text is broken. So how do we, including, at the end, middle of these lines right here. So how do we, never mind, of course, at the bottom. So how do we restore anything? Well, we have full translation of lines. Okay. That's, easy enough. This is in Aramaic. But you get to the end of line 7, and all you have is Ram, son. The material that's in brackets is restored by the scholar, the late Joseph Naveh of the Hebrew University, who published this inscription. all you can read is Ram, son, blank. But on the next line 8, it says King of Israel. And so, since we know the name, you'll see this on the next slide, since we know the name of every single king of Israel and king of Judah, we know that this must be Jehoram, the son of Ahab, because he is the only king of Israel whose name ends in Ram. Therefore, we can reconstruct that Hazael must have said, I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel. And then the continuation in line 8, again, where it's broken, all we can read is Yahu. Of course, there were many, or that would be in English, I-A-H, Yah, but there were many such kings of Judah who had that name. So how do we know which one it was? Because the book of Kings tells us that Achaziah, or Achaziahu, ben, or son of Jehoram, was the king of the house of David, and you see the house of David on line 9. So all we can read in one line 7 is Ram, son, who has to be the king of Israel from line 8. And then the rest of line 8, Yahu, son of, and that has to be Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, which is to say it's a little confusing because the king of Israel at one point was named Jehoram, and the father of the king of Judah was also named Jehoram. So that's what the inscription says, and it tells us that Hazael, the king of Aram, whose name is not mentioned here, but we all attribute it to him. Hadad is the name of an Aramean god, equivalent to Baal of the Canaanites. And so this is an exceedingly important inscription because it mentions both Israel. Israel is mentioned twice in the bridge between lines 3 and 4, and then, as you can see, in line 8. And of course, most importantly, House of David in line 9. And so here's that key line, and here are the years of the individual kings. In fact, Jehoram of Israel overlapped with Jehoram of Judah, two totally different individuals for a decade or so, almost a decade. But we know that Jehoram was the son of Ahab. He replaced his brother Ahaziah on the throne when Ahaziah died young. And on the Judah side, Ahaziah is the son of Jehoram. Apologies for all the confusion because of the overlapping names. By the way, it's like the Middle Ages, right? When all the kings of all the kings of England and the kings of France, they were all named Henry, right? And then you get all the Louis, and how many of these names can you keep straight? So we have to do that with medieval European history, and we have to do that with Israel and Judah when both kingdoms are using the same names. So the inscription is written in an adaptation of the Phoenician alphabet, which spread to the Hebrews and to the Arameans. The letter shapes are more or less what you see here, reading right to left, if you want to see how the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet work. And as I show you Aramaic and Moabite inscriptions and so on, you will see that these are the inscriptions. These are the forms of the 22 letters of the alphabet. There's our word, Beit David again, House of David. Apologies. And we looked at this last time, although our interest then was the use of the word House of David towards the end of the Mesha inscription. So from more or less the same time period, we have a reference from Mesha, the king of Moab, to Omri and his son. It actually doesn't mention Ahab but by name, but it has to be Ahab. Near the top of the inscription, Omri and Ahab will be implied. And again, the Bible refers to the wars between Israel and Moab, just as it does between Israel and Aram. And so we can piece these extra biblical sources, we can coordinate these extra biblical sources with the material that we find in the Bible. And again, just to show you our two kingdoms, Israel, Dan, notice how close Dan is to Damascus. I didn't make it clear, let me point out. Dan is not on this map, but it's about right here, and you can see Damascus. The northern extensions of Israel was closer to Damascus than it was to its own capital city of Samaria, never mind to Jerusalem. And what the inscription says is that Hazael, the king of Aram, gained control of Dan and other cities in the region and set up the stone inscription that I showed you, having defeated the king of Israel and his ally, the king of Judah, who came to assist him. And once he became the ruler of this area, he set up that stone inscription. And it was found right there in the city gate area that I showed you earlier in 1993, 1994. At the end of last week's lecture, I described how it was found and how I was in Israel that summer on sabbatical and how we all gathered at Professor Mazar's home to discuss it. And Moab is here in this area, or this map over here, so you can see that when it has battles with Israel, it's fighting in this area, and that's what the Mesha Stela is describing as well. The Book of Kings coordinated, because of the historical detail in the Book of Kings, coordinated well with these extra biblical inscriptions. And so Mesha says, I am Mesha, son of Chemosh God, king of Moab, the Dibonite, that's the name of the city where he ruled, Dibon. Omri was king of Israel, etc. Omri took the land, which was my land, occupied it in his day and in the days of his son, that would be Ahab, and so on and so forth, until Mesha tells us how he came and took over that region once again by defeating Israel. And so here is the names of these kings. I've now included Omri on the list. I've expanded the list from before. So we don't have Ahab mentioned explicitly in the Mesha Stele, which I've graded out a little bit. But again, you can see how we're using these extra biblical discoveries from the world of archaeology to illuminate for us the world of the Bible. Now, for everything else I'm going to show you, we go to Mesopotamia. Because by the 9th century, the kingdom of Assyria began to expand westward. Assyria, from the homeland, you'll see the map in a little bit, of northern Iraq, what is today northern Iraq, and the city of Nineveh near Mosul, Assyria began to expand westward and began to swallow up the little kingdoms, or attempted to swallow up the little kingdoms. I mean, eventually they did. And the first one to really create a large army and move westward was King Shalmaneser III. And it's the same time period that we've just been talking about. It's the same time period of the Tel Dan inscription and the Mesha Stela. This is his very large monument, 2.2 meters high, 7 feet high, at the British Museum. And it describes in detail, in cuneiform, the Battle of Karkar, which is a site in northern Syria. Now, Shalmaneser describes how he fought against an alliance of 12 Western kings. That is to say, various Aramean kings, some Phoenician city-state kings, and so on. And amongst the 12 allies was Ahab of Israel, who supplies, he tells us which each of the allies supplied. Ahab supplied 2,000 chariots, that's the most chariots of anybody in the alliance, and 10,000 soldiers, that's the second most number of soldiers of anybody in the alliance. And these 12 allies, we call them the Western allies, were, here's the cuneiform up close to get a sense of how the cuneiform text reads. And these 12 allies, you see all those arrows there coming, in fact, from further south, of Jerusalem even, met the Assyrian army, which marched westward from Nineveh, and they met at Karkar, and the 12 kingdoms of the west successfully stopped the advance of the Assyrian army at Karkar. Any one of these kingdoms would not have been able to do it alone. They would have been all swallowed up one by one, but by banding together, they were able to stop the Assyrian advance. Not to worry, the Assyrians will return a century later and will gobble up all these countries, including Israel. By the way, there is some debate on this. We really don't think that anybody, Judah, by the way, is not mentioned in this inscription. So only Israel from Samaria and Tyre and Damascus and these areas sent troops to Karkar to stop the Assyrian advance. I would not use these arrows down here at the bottom. Judah was not involved. Egypt was not involved. Different scholars read the text slightly differently. I don't think that I would, but this is the map that I could find. So there you have the Battle of Karkar in northern Syria. Also from the time of Shalmaneser III, 12 years later, we have this black obelisk also in the British Museum. And the Assyrians may not have returned with their army, but they exacted tribute from various kingdoms in that region that I just showed you on the prior map. Basically, a kind of blackmail. Pay us tribute, or we're going to come back with our army. So these would be vassal kings to Shalmaneser III. Now, at this point, Jehu is the king of Israel. The dynasty of Omri and Ahab, one of the dynasties that lasted only 3 generations, so-called dynasty, was replaced by the dynasty that Jehu established. That's the one that lasted 4 generations. And Jehu, keep wanting to retain Israel's independence, basically said yes to Shalmaneser III. The previous story, this one, is not mentioned in the Bible, and nor is this mentioned in the Bible. The biblical authors are selective in the information they give us, and Shalmaneser III is not mentioned in the Bible. Later Assyrian kings will be. I'll point them out to you. So this is one of the great examples of why archaeology is so important. It sheds considerable light on what Ahab and Jehu and so on are doing. The Bible is filled with stories about Ahab and Jehu, Ahab and Jezebel, Jehu destroying the temple of Baal. In other words, the biblical authors are interested more in the religious lives of these kings, more so than they are in the geopolitics of the day, and we're able to flesh out some of that geopolitical dealings because of these great monuments, the Shalmaneser III cork stela, which I showed you, and now the black obelisk. Now let's have a look closer at the black obelisk. Here you can see it's on all 4 sides. And you see that it has various what we call registers. And the second registers going all around on all 4 sides is the section dealing with Israel. And the inscription that you see here above says, tells us that this is King Jehu bowing down before Shalmaneser III. So here's the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser III. He has always somebody behind him holding palm branch for shade, and he has other courtiers with him. Jehu is bowing down here with other Israelites behind him paying tribute. And that's what all 4 sides of the black obelisk show. We don't know whether this is King Jehu himself. Did he journey to Nineveh? Did he journey to meet Shalmaneser somewhere between Samaria and Nineveh? Is this an emissary? It says Jehu, but we don't know for sure. And here is the cuneiform inscription, which somewhat interestingly refers to Jehu as the son of Omri, even though he's not. Jehu replaced that dynasty, but the memo may not have reached the Assyrian scribes who knew about Omri and his son Ahab and so on, and they may not have realized that the current king of Israel was actually a usurper and had taken over the throne. So they still call him the son of Omri, meaning of that dynasty, but he actually is not. We know him from a totally different royal family that he himself establishes on the throne. But just a little bit of cuneiform writing for you, the caption to those pictures. And if we look at these pictures, they're just phenomenal in what you can see. The king doing obeisance now to the Assyrian king, but the inscription above tells you what the Israelites are bringing. So here are the tribute bearers on all the other 3 sides, and you can just see the items that they're bringing one after another as I'm showing you the other 3 sides. So what it tells us in the cuneiform around, it says that the tribute was silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase, buckets, tin, etc. So if we go back and look at these, here's the golden bowl right here that is being brought. Here is the golden vase with a pointed bottom. That's what the Assyrian inscription says. A staff for a king, that would be this. Spears, probably these things here. Golden buckets, I guess those are these things here. Tin, these are tin ingots. Tin is very valuable. So that's the black obelisk informing us something we would never know from the Bible, that the king of Israel had become a vassal to the king of Assyria and was actually paying him tribute, which would, needless to say, deplete the royal treasury in Samaria to a great extent. If we go forward just a little bit, another 30, 40 years, we come to the reign of King Jeroboam. As you can see, he ruled for 40 years. He is the longest ruling king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And the one thing I can show you from King Jeroboam is what you see in front of you. This is a seal of one of his servants, which is to say one of his courtiers. It says in the Hebrew there, of or belonging to Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. And we know from the stratigraphy of Megiddo, where this was found, that it's not Jeroboam the first who established the kingdom in the 900s, but rather Jeroboam the second. This was found in Megiddo in 1904. I wrote Istanbul Museum because that's where it is located, but I also have to tell you that it's gone missing. No one has seen it in half a century. No one assumes anything nefarious. Things just get lost in in very huge, vast, extensive museums. But it was found by archaeologists. It's clearly not a forgery. In the excavations in 1904 by German excavators, it was published early on with a photo, which you see here, and a good, I think this is a colorized version of that original black and white photo, and a good line drawing. So we know that this is actually real. Now, what was the seal used for? Just to give you a little bit of the Paleo-Hebrew script, for those of you who know Hebrew, Lamed, Shin, Mem, Ayin, Lishema, Ayin, Bet, Dalid, Yud, Resh, Bet, Ayin, Mem, Eved, Yerovam. No word divider, nothing there, just the servant of Jeroboam the king. So there's Megiddo, where it's located. A key site in the northern kingdom of Israel. Again, well excavated. The Germans, University of Chicago, Yigal Yadin, Israel Finkelstein, everybody has dug at Megiddo at some point. And so, as we mentioned, the Assyrian Empire begins to grow. And you can see its original homeland here in Nineveh, with other cities nearby. And as it's in French, as the chart shows you here, each century increasing its area until eventually it envelops Israel as well. But let's take our break right now and ask if anyone has any questions on anything that I have done up until now.
I did see one comment before there was a question. Somebody commented that for dynastic longevity in the ancient world, I doubt anyone beats the Zhou in China, 790 years from 1046 to 256 BCE. So
thank you for educating me, and I did not know that. And by the way, we should mention, as long as we're talking about long-lasting dynasties, that King Charles III is a descendant of William the Conqueror. And if he lives to 2066, he will be celebrating the 1,000th year of the establishment of England, and to which were eventually added other parts of Great Britain and the United Kingdom. But I believe the current emperor of Japan's dynasty goes back even longer than that. So these long-lived royal families are quite remarkable. Thanks for the information about China in the Middle Ages, I assume. Or maybe antiquity. I'm referring to only the ancient Near East, which is the world that I know. Yeah.
Yeah, this is antiquity. They were the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou too, but I think they're the same dynasty. I'm not sure.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, I do the global history. So, okay. Are there any seals, papyri, or texts from the 10th century?
No. We have very little from the 10th century. And it raises the following question, and it is an answer. It's a really, this is important to know. When cities are destroyed, typically what you get when you go to, and that's what archaeologists find when they excavate. We're jumping ahead, but the Assyrian Empire will destroy Dan, Chatzor, Megiddo, Samaria, we see the destruction level, all of them in the 700s. We'll get there right after the break. Um, what you basically get is the 8th century BCE frozen in time. You don't really get the 9th or 10th century. And when Jerusalem is destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians, you might have a building like David's palace, which we saw last time, which is still in use. But what's in that building is not going to be 10th century material, but mainly 8th and 7th century material. Which is to say, if my home was destroyed right now, and you came to excavate it, you would find 20th and 21st century material. And or let's my home is 20 years old. Okay, let's go to England, right? If you went to a Cotswolds village or something and the buildings are from the 1600s and it got destroyed, yeah, you'd see a building from the 1600s, but all of its contents would be from the 20th and 21st century. So the answer to the question is no seals, papyri, or text from the 10th century. I'm going to show some papyri in a few minutes. And that always raises the question, and this may be behind what the questioner is asking. Well, then, based on what I said last week, how could they have been writing the book of Genesis or the Torah or anything in the 10th century? And my colleague Avi Faust, whom I quoted 2 weeks ago from Bar Ilan, is fond of saying about 10th century sites, we also don't have any ovens dated to the 10th century. That doesn't mean they weren't baking bread. Right? They obviously were. All we get are 8th and 7th century ovens because that's the destruction level, either of the Assyrians in northern cities or the Babylonians in southern cities. So I hope that answers the question. It's a long answer to a very good question, which explains why it's almost impossible to find 10th century material.
So next is a question just for clarification that the Merneptah stele is in Egypt is the earliest mention of Israel.
Right, and that goes back, 200 years prior to David. Yeah.
Okay. Now to the Q&A. A question about the black obelisk. I know that eunuchs were common in the Assyrian court, usually identifiable by their lack of beards. So I assume the beardless figures behind the Assyrian kings are eunuchs. However, the king of Israel seems to be accompanied by beardless figures as well. I didn't think there were eunuchs in Israel or Judah.
Fascinating. I did not pay attention to that. I'm so interested in reading the cuneiform. I don't even, I didn't even notice that. I do look at the pictures, of course. That is a great observation, and I would say most likely you are correct. And there were eunuchs in Israel. I'm trying to think if there's a biblical passage. The Hebrew word saris, which by the way is an Assyrian word borrowed into Hebrew, is used for various eunuchs in various royal courts. I don't know if I have a ready passage. I can look it up after the lecture, whether that Hebrew word saris ever is used for a eunuch in the court of Israel or Judah. But the assumption is that there were.
The next question is about the 10 lost tribes. I think it's how are there 9 tribes in Israel if you have the 10 lost tribes, right?
The Bible is so confusing on this. When the kingdom splits, it refers to the 10 tribes of the north. And then it says only Judah remained in the south. Well, that's a problem because 10 plus 1 equals 11, not 12. And then it says that Benjamin joined Judah. Okay, well, that would be 10 plus 2 equals 12. But then what do you do with Simeon, which is to the south of Judah? Now, to a great extent, Simeon doesn't exist anymore. The last reference to Simeon is in the book of Judges. So this is a problem. If you look at the map of the tribes, there are only 9 tribes in the north. You have to assume Benjamin, as I said, Benjamin, Judah, and Simeon in the south. There are only 9 tribes in the north, including the 2.5 tribes in Transjordan. So it's possible that the biblical author just rounded it off to 10. It's possible that he was counting the Levites who lived amongst the northern tribes. It's possible that he counted the 2 halves of Manasseh twice. Eastern Manasseh, east of the Jordan, and the main part of Manasseh, west of the Jordan. It remains an enigma as to how you get 10, but I suspect that that's where we get our 10.
Are there any seals, papyri, or texts from the 10th century? Oh, did I already answer? Did we already ask
Yeah,
this
I think
one?
we did. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, let me dismiss that. Okay. Also, why did Israel and Judah split? Can you comment on the differences in their respective versions of Hebrew?
Okay, so the split happened because of the following. I didn't go into the details, but yeah, another wonderful question. So Solomon taxed the 12 tribes heavily. Uh, we didn't discuss this last week, but who's going to pay for this temple building project? Who's going to pay for the fortifications in Gezer, Chatzor, and Megiddo? Who's going to pay for what apparently was either a newly built palace or an expansion of David's palace? Well, you're going to do it with taxation. Now, there's no money. Money doesn't exist, but you exact uh, taxes or tribute from your people who have to support the royal family in the form of grain and wine and olive oil and flocks and whatever, sheep and goats and whatever you produce, you have to, send a portion of it to the royal family. That's the taxation system. So, um, who was benefiting from this? The people in Judah, because Jerusalem was on their doorstep. The people in the north were not benefiting from all of these great building projects, except for the fortifications in Chatzor and Megiddo, which are in the north. But it looks like they were paying their taxes and not getting it back in any tangible way, whereas the people of Judah, where Jerusalem is located, could see the benefits of Solomon's building projects paid for by a taxation of the entire land. And that is the usual explanation for why the northern tribes split and said no more. The Bible, of course, uses the theological yardstick to measure everything. So the biblical author in Kings says that the tribes were torn from Solomon's control, or from his son and successor Rehoboam's control, because Solomon had sinned by going off to worship other gods under the influence of all of his foreign wives. So the Bible uses this theological yardstick, but we can also see enough material in the book of Kings from the objective historical perspective that I'm using right now, to assume that it was a high taxation system. That is what drove the people of the Northern Kingdom to say, we do not want to follow this Davidic Solomonic dynasty. And the founder of their kingdom, Jeroboam I, convinced the people that they should do that. And of course, if you're going to do that, you're still going to worship the same God, but you can't go to Jerusalem anymore, which is now foreign territory. So you have to build new temples to the God of Israel in Dan and Bethel. Hope that helps. What
Thank
a
you very
great
much.
series of questions.
Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you so much. I think we're ready to continue.
Good. And then like I said, we'll have plenty of time towards the end again. Okay. As we said, Assyria begins to expand, and you can see that eventually it incorporates Israel, including Samaria. It conquers parts of Judah, but never Jerusalem, as we'll see in a few minutes. So, a series of Assyrian attacks on the kingdom of Israel, and all those cities I mentioned, Dan, Chatzor, Megiddo, Jezreel, Samaria, all these sites, you can see the destruction level in the archaeology of the 8th century. So the Assyrians start coming back, and the Bible refers to some of the kings of Israel still paying tribute to Assyria, but eventually the treasury runs dry, and Assyria just says enough of this, and they just swallow up not just Israel, by the way. I mean, these Aramean kingdoms, Philistia, all these little kingdoms cannot withstand Syria, and the idea of creating an alliance of Western allies no longer is an option, apparently, until the kingdom of Israel comes to an end in the year 721, and you have the deportation of the northern tribes to the various places that you see here on the map, including to Nineveh and further east into Media, which is modern-day Western Iran. And then we get the 10 lost tribes. Now, they're never really lost, except to say the following. The biblical camera, the biblical narrator, does not follow these tribes into Assyria and into exile into the areas beyond Assyria. The camera remains in Jerusalem because the Bible comes to us through Judah, and the Bible's vantage point is Judah. That stands in contrast to the Babylonian conquest of Judah. We'll get there at the end, when the camera, I'm using camera, of course, metaphorically here, when the camera will go with the exiles to Babylon, because the prophets 2nd Isaiah and Ezekiel are in Babylon, and we hear the words, especially from Ezekiel, referring to current events in Babylon. So essentially, the biblical text waves goodbye to these northern exiles as they go off, and there are occasional later references to them in biblical text. So they're the 10 quasi-lost tribes. Okay. The quasi-10 quasi-lost tribes. And there again is that map. Now, Assyria, of course, isn't going to stop because they're going to continue. And several years later, they attack Judah as well. And we have a very good description of it from this prism-shaped cuneiform inscription written by the new king of Assyria, Sennacherib, and it's written on all 6 sides. We actually have 3 versions of this. I'm showing you the tailored prism in the British Museum. And it mentions the ransacking of Judah and all the cities in the Judean countryside, and the siege of Jerusalem, including mention King Hezekiah by name, here in this cuneiform text. The 2 other copies, one is at the Israel Museum on the right, and one is at the Oriental Institute in Chicago on the left. So that the king of Assyria made multiple copies through his cuneiform scribes. And he says, it's dated to the year 701 BCE. It's year 4 or 5 of Sennacherib's reign. That's how we can date it. As to Hezekiah the Judahite, I laid siege to 46 of his cities. I drove out 200,000 people, probably an exaggeration. Towards the bottom, I made him a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage, which is to say, I besieged Jerusalem. I surrounded the city, and Hezekiah couldn't get out, nor could anybody from Jerusalem, like a bird in a cage. A wonderful metaphor. Now, so here's Jerusalem, just south of the border. By the way, when the kingdom of Israel fell, not everybody was deported to Assyria. Many people fled southward, not such a long distance, and took refuge in Jerusalem. And we know that the population of Jerusalem swelled in the second half of the 8th century because of these former northerners just moving across the border and welcomed in by the people of Jerusalem. This is a map of Sennacherib's campaign. We can actually, because of the details provided in his own inscriptions, tell you exactly which route he took to get to Lachish there in the south and Jerusalem on the map as well. Now, these are the reconstructed city walls of Nineveh. Not all of this was found, but Saddam Hussein, some decades ago, decided we should really build it up, and they put up some new stones, but this is what it looks like. In that palace in Nineveh, in the throne room, King Sennacherib had his artist decorate the walls with these reliefs. And you can see these in many, many museums. I was just in the Brooklyn Museum, for example, on Sunday, where I was looking at the Assyrian wall reliefs there from a prior king, not this one. And the British Museum is filled with all of this, excavated by Layard in the 1840s. Here's the British Museum building. And one of the rooms, room 10 on the ground floor of the British Museum, is devoted to Sennacherib's siege of Lachish. Again, I would ask how many of you have been to the British Museum. You can wave your hands virtually for me. So what you're looking at here are the wall reliefs which depict the Battle of Lachish, which was the second largest city in Judah, which is to say, I'm sort of, spoiler alert, but I'll say it right now. Sennacherib never was able to conquer Jerusalem. Notice he didn't say that he conquered Jerusalem. He said he besieged it. Hezekiah I kept there like a bird in a cage. He never says he conquered it, and he did not. We know the kingdom of Judah will continue for another century plus. So his artists, when they returned to Nineveh with their sketches most likely, could portray only the defeat of the second most populous city in the kingdom of Judah, and that was Lachish. Look at these remarkable murals. So here are the Assyrian soldiers with their helmets and beards approaching Lachish. Here they are on a siege ramp. This is the way the artist has portrayed the siege ramp. In other words, they built a ramp, and I'm going to show it to you, to get up to the top of the city. And these are their battering rams, which the Assyrians mastered. And here are flaming torches being thrown. Here are Israelites being impaled. We'll come back and look at all this in just a minute, closer up. Here is that battering ram coming up the siege ramp. The Israelite fighters on top of the city wall with their bows and arrows and their shields. But at the same time, exiting the city gate are Israelite families, women, children, and men with them. And these would be slingshots. You're getting a sense of the chaos of war. Look at the battering ram with its thing here, which is going to hopefully cause the tower to go down. Assyrian archers and sling shooters. And here are Israelite families being taken away captive, women, children, and the head of household driving the oxen. And on the left there, you see the youngest children riding in the cart being pulled by the oxen. And they eventually come, so all of those panels, it's a whole series that I'm showing you here. They eventually come and they stand before Sennacherib, who is on a throne, which is raised. Notice the footstool. I'm now paying attention to the beardless men behind him with the palm fronds to keep him cool. I guess those are eunuchs. And the Israelite noblemen being led in by Assyrian soldiers on the left there, who now has to stand before Sennacherib. And now you're supposed to say to me, how do we know these are the people of Judah? How do we know this is Lachish? It's just a bunch of pictures. It could be any Assyrian assault on any city in Canaan or anywhere else. And the answer is, as you may already have supposed, you see the cuneiform inscription above, and this is what it says. This is Layard's original publication from 1849, and he transcribes the Assyrian. And it says, Sennacherib, the mighty king, king of Assyria, sitting on the throne before the city of Lachish. Okay, so that's how we know that what is being portrayed here is the Assyrian siege on Lachish. These are Layard's own drawings. He was the most remarkable individual who is the founder of the archaeology of the Near East. And here you see him as a young man, a trained draftsman, and as an older man. And that's his book, Nineveh and its Remains, from 1849. Now, the wonder of the story that I've just told you is that we can actually go to Lachish and excavate it. This is the modern Moshav right here, and this is the Tell, the archaeological site of Lachish, which again was excavated by the British during the Mandate period, by a series of Israeli institutions, Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University. Everybody has done some excavations at Lachish. Here is the actual siege ramp. So you saw the Assyrian art. Here's the ramp itself. You can go visit it. You can go walk up it. Found by the British when they excavated there in the 1930s are all those sling stones, which I showed you in the reliefs. The sling you see here, because that's rope and biodegradable, was not found. That's a modern sling. But these are the sling stones that were found there, and they are now on display at the British Museum. And so Lachish provides us with something quite unique in the biblical world. We have the text on the left. We have the artwork that you see in the middle, and we have the archaeology from the site itself. And we can piece it all together along with the biblical text and get a very good story, which hopefully I have presented here for you this evening in a coherent fashion relevant to the story of Lachish. Now, as I mentioned, Jerusalem is welcoming all manner of Israelites from the northern kingdom, and it leads to Jerusalem doubling, if not tripling, in size from the 10th century City of David and Temple Mount area, which I showed you last time, to the entire Western Hill, which is this area right here. These are the old city walls that you see here of today. These are the Ottoman walls. So most of the Western Hill is within, some of the Western Hill, as we call it, is within the old city walls of today. Some of it is on the other side of the old city walls. Again, excavations have revealed quite a bit. Well, the Gihon is still operating. We talked about it last week. It's still the major spring. But the Gihon here, you'll recall, here's the Western Hill. How are you going to get the water from the Gihon to the Western Hill? And so the Bible tells us that Hezekiah, both in the book of Kings and rehearsed in the book of Chronicles, built a tunnel which brought water into the city to the west side of the city of David. So they built this underground tunnel, and here we are in Hezekiah's tunnel. It's an extension of the water system that we talked about last week that was used by David's men to actually infiltrate the city and conquer it. Hezekiah extends it 1,200 cubits, about 1,800 feet, to bring water to the Western Hill. So here is two maps, one in English, one in Hebrew, which brings the water from the Gihon spring over here or here, and in this S shape brings the water to a pool, the Siloam pool. This is a later pool, to the Siloam pool right here via this water channel. Everybody wants to know, by the way, why such a circuitous route? Why didn't they just dig a straight line? And the answer is, you see the contours? They follow the natural fissures in the rock. This is what the geologists who have studied this to inform us that this is how they actually dug it. Moreover, they dug from both ends. I'll show you how we know that in just a moment. And the map on the left doesn't show it to you, but the map here does. This was the meeting place of the men with their pickaxes, okay? The hewers of the stone. This was their meeting place right here as they dug from both ends. Okay, so back into Hezekiah's tunnel. At the southern end of the tunnel, inside the tunnel, not on public display, is this inscription called the Siloam Tunnel inscription, which was removed in the 1800s during the Ottoman period, which is why it's today in Istanbul, and it describes the construction of the tunnel. This is a line drawing of it. It does not mention Hezekiah. Instead, it celebrates the workmen who did the work. They have put a replica of it in the spot where the rock was hewn out by the modern archaeologists to be displayed in Istanbul. So you can actually see it in place if you go through the tunnel today. And this is what it says. It says that they started each from each end, and when there were 3 cubits left to be cut through, they could hear the voices of the other people on the other side digging through the rock. And the quarrymen hewed the rock 4 lines from the bottom, each man toward his fellow, axe against axe, and the water flowed from the spring 1,200 cubits, which is, by the way, it is exactly, approximately 1,200 cubits long, and they are about 100 cubits below the surface, as it says in this inscription. They're celebrating the work that they did, not King Hezekiah. And they must have had some literate quarryman or brought a scribe in. And again, it's not a public display. It's right there inside the tunnel on the southern end. Um, Moving to other material related to King Hezekiah, this was a major discovery in 2015. I showed you Eilat Mazar last time. She found in her excavation 10 years ago a bulla of King Hezekiah. And it says there on the top, belonging to, which is just the Hebrew letter Lamed, of or to, belonging to Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah. And yes, that's an Egyptian Ankh sign. They like to use some of these Egyptian symbols. And even the winged solar disk is an Egyptian symbol. So this is, a treasure, a tiny little thing. I'm going to show you how, they're this big, a treasure found by Eilat Mazar in the excavations of Jerusalem. Now, what is a bulla? And actually, it relates to the seal that I showed you earlier, the one that was found in Megiddo, which has gone missing. The scribes in the ancient world, Israel, Aram, Moab, all these places were writing on papyrus scrolls. Phoenicia. The papyrus is biodegradable. We've lost it, it all, with a few exceptions that I'll show you in just a moment. This is a facsimile. They would write the addressee on the outside, and they would, roll it or fold it as you see here. They would tie string around it, which you can see, and then they would put a lump of clay right here, and they would impress the seal into the lump of clay. The seal, by the way, had to be created by the seal maker in mirror image, so that the letters had to be mirror image, so when you stamped it, it was legible. We don't really go to see stamps in the post office or the library card in the back of the library book anymore. But you know that those little machines that the postal workers and librarians have, all the numbers and letters there are mirror images so that when you stamp, you can actually see it. Ditto for those seals. So what we find in excavations are seals by the scores and bullae, the plural of bulla, by the hundreds, because those lumps of clay remain after everything else biodegraded, the string, the papyrus, and so on. So that's what the bulla of, this is a lump of clay hardened, into which the seal of Hezekiah had been stamped. So we have stamp seals and bullae, which we find in excavations, and they inform us a lot about scribal culture and royal administration and governmental administration, and obviously only people of substance, the king, his courtiers, and so on, would have such a seal. We have 3 pieces of papyrus from ancient Israel, all found near the Dead Sea, where it's dry enough, where the arid climate, most of you are in Arizona. I don't have to teach you about arid climate. Obviously in Egypt, we find papyrus scrolls everywhere, literally 20-meter long papyrus scrolls. The longest ones at the British Museum, 41 meters intact, half a football field, one single papyrus scroll. In Israel, we treasure every little bit that we have. This is actually a palimpsest. It was found in 1952. Palimpsest means that underneath, you can see there was a writing that they scraped off and reused the papyrus, and this is the overtext right here. Through UV and infrared, we can actually read the undertext as much as we can the overtext. It's a small bit. It's a list of names. That's all we get there, but it's precious to us. It's a papyrus from the time of the Kingdom of Judah. This one was discovered in 2016. Most likely from the Judean desert, not found by an archaeologist, but it appeared on the antiquities market, but it has been authenticated by the experts, including those who deal with inscriptions, and it refers to the delivery of wine to the king from some caves, probably some caves out towards the Judean desert. And the third one was also purchased on the antiquities market in 1965. It refers to a person named Ishmael, and it was actually in private hands just up until 3 years ago by somebody in the U.S. And the person who realized that he owned this, that he inherited it from his parents, realized that this was something pretty important and donated it back to the Israel Antiquities Authority. He lived in Montana. So this is this was big news in 2022. Israel acquires rare ancient papyrus with Hebrew inscription from a Montana resident. We assume that it was looted from a cave in the Judean desert, made its way through a dealer to somebody in the U.S., and thank you to the gentleman in Montana who returned it to the Israel Antiquities Authority. So we now have 3 pieces of papyrus, which I just showed you, tiny little pieces with Hebrew letters on them, but they would have been the kinds of documents that you would have had with bullae and seals. By the late 7th century, there's a new world power, and that's Babylonia. Nineveh falls in 612. The final battle takes place in Carchemish, where the Babylonians defeat the Assyrians, and the Assyrians disappear from world history, never to be seen again. They are now swallowed up into the Babylonian Empire, and Babylonia, just like Assyria before it, starts building its empire in a westerly direction, and they come to Judah in 597 with the first deportation of Judeans and would return with their army in 586, which leads to the destruction. I didn't mention this with Assyria, and I didn't mention it with Babylonia either. I probably should mention it now. What did they care about these little kingdoms like Israel and Judah? The answer is what was on the other side, and that's Egypt. In other words, the only power in the world that could possibly stop the Assyrians and the Babylonians was Egypt. The real goal of these Mesopotamian empires was to defeat the Egyptians. It's just that Israel and Judah were in the way, and Philistia and all these other little kingdoms you had to march through. Assyria, occupied or conquered Egypt for a short period of time and then had to withdraw. Babylonia doesn't conquer Egypt either. So they were never successful in getting to Egypt. Assyria for a brief interlude, but that was it. In any case, here is the Babylonian Empire. You see the map shows you, Egypt still an independent kingdom. And Judah, indicated there on the map, is now incorporated into the Babylonian Empire, but so is everything else. The places we looked at before. Nineveh has fallen. The final battle, they're showing it to you here, 609, Carchemish, Phoenicia, Judah, what had been Israel, all now part of the Babylonian Empire. We have a document in the British Museum. We can't hear all the laughter when I say this. You know the British Museum, affectionately referred to in my field as the Third Temple. I mean, how many of these treasures have I shown you are in the British Museum? It's a chronicle. It's the Annals of King Nebuchadnezzar II, which refers to the defeat of the city of Judah. It actually doesn't say Jerusalem. It says the city of Judah, but of course we know what that means. That means Jerusalem. And that leads to the exiles of Judah going to Babylonia, as this map indicates for you as well. Yes, a number of people of Judah fled to Egypt in the opposite direction, including the prophet Jeremiah, actually against his will, but he was taken down by other Judeans who were fleeing to Egypt. And so we have the beginning of 2 Jewish diasporas, one in Egypt and one in Babylonia. And in fact, last year, when I presented a lecture for Arizona State, the lecture I presented when I was in Phoenix was called The First Diasporas, and we've done it in sort of reverse order, but that would be the sequel to the story I am telling you right now. In Search of Ancient Israel, and this evening's lecture, In Search of Israel and Judah, meaning the 2 kingdoms of Israel and Judah, really provides us with quite a bit of primary sources dealing with Israel and Judah, mentioning individuals by name, kings by name, places by name. We actually have real history when we get to the 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th centuries B.C.E. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rendsburg. Thank you so much. Okay, there were some question. Was the breakup of North and South peaceful?
Generally, the answer is yes. The story in the Book of Kings when Solomon dies is, let me refresh my memory here. Yes, there was for a moment the threat of war that the kingdom of Judah would not allow the kingdom of Israel to separate and create its own kingdom. But Rehoboam came to his senses and realized, okay, let them separate, and they became two kingdoms. There were times when they actually battled each other in some skirmishes, and there were times when they were allies together, like in the Tel Dan inscription, where the king of Aram says, I defeated the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. And that's implied in the Mesha inscription as well. So they understood they were one people, but two political entities now. And so typically or frequently would, cooperate, collaborate. And certainly when the kingdom of Israel fell, Judah apparently opened its arms and allowed the co-religionists from the north to come into Jerusalem and swell, the size of the city. Yeah.
Thank you. So some clarifying remarks about eunuchs. Jewish eunuchs were not all born Jewish. They were sometimes acquired, some joined from other countries, and some were born with physical differences. The word seris does not always mean a castrated male. It could also include those who could not reproduce. There's a story about Potiphar was a seris and was married. This is from Genesis. I hope this sheds some light.
So there's a debate as to whether every time the word saris appears in the Bible, does it mean an actual eunuch, a castrated male, or does it come to mean simply courtier? Because it's an extension of the person who was in the court. And the eunuchs were originally in charge of the harem, which is why they could be trusted because they were castrated males. Even the Potiphar story is not, who's a courtier, a saris, a eunuch, a pharaoh, doesn't prove anything. The late Chaim Tadmor, a great professor at the Hebrew University, whom I remember most fondly, a student of Benjamin Mazar, you can see how we're all connected. He was there that evening in Mazar's house as well. He wrote a seminal article in which he argued that saris always means eunuch. And there were married eunuchs. We know about that. In fact, we had married eunuchs. By the way, eunuchs existed into the 20th century in the Ottoman Empire and in China. So we certainly know about their lives, and we have the hints of their lives in ancient times as well. And you could be married and still be a eunuch. In fact, it has been suggested that that's why Potiphar's wife went after Joseph, because she couldn't get what she wanted from home with her husband, the eunuch. You may say, why would a woman marry a eunuch? And the answer is, you get to live in the palace. Much better than, and a pretty good life, much better than living in some, rural farming community or something like that. So there's still debate on this. I actually follow Professor Todd Moore, and think that yes, until we can show otherwise, every saris is an actual eunuch, serving a king.
So what actually happened historically with Sancherib's attempt to conquer Jerusalem? Why didn't they capture it, and why did the army withdraw?
The Bible says that there was an outbreak of a plague in the Assyrian army encamped on the outskirts of Jerusalem, outside the city walls. And we'll assume that that's probably what happened. In fact, several centuries later, Herodotus tells the same story. Well, not quite the same story, but he alludes to the same kind of thing. The Bible also refers to, that's the biblical story. It could simply, it may be true, we have no way of judging. It could simply be that for 2 or 3 years of the siege, Assyria finally realized they can't conquer Jerusalem. There was some political unrest back home in Nineveh. That might have been a factor. So multiple factors may have led to the Assyrians simply retreating. The impregnability of Jerusalem, the defenses that Hezekiah had built up, the water supply, the grain silos were full. They could still live in the city. Any number of reasons why the Assyrians retreated, right? And the plague may be an accurate account. Yeah.
So, were there different dialects of Hebrew between Israel and Judah? If so, can you give some examples of differences?
Part of my life work has been to trace the dialectal differences between northern Israel and southern Judah. The standard in the Bible, what we call standard biblical Hebrew, is really the dialect of Judah, because, as I said, so much of the material in the Bible comes from Judah in general and Jerusalem in particular. But we have portions from the northern kingdom of Israel, including the annals of the kings of Israel, which get embedded into the book of Kings. I mean, they're edited there by Judean editors, but they are authentic northern material, as are the stories of the northern prophets like Elijah and Elisha. And I published a whole book on the subject of Northern Hebrew in the Book of Kings. And just 2 weeks ago, an article that I wrote just came out in an Israeli journal, but it's in Hebrew, called Northern Hebrew in the Book of Kings. They invited me to write an article and summarize my book of 20 years ago. So there are multiple examples. Some of them, for those of you who know Hebrew, you might still be able to hear some. So, for example, how do you say this feminine in Hebrew? Well, zot is the standard form in the Bible, but zo appears, and zo appears typically in northern texts, the feminine form of this. Hebrew uses different forms for masculine and feminine. The masculine is the same but throughout Israel, but zo would be a good example. And similarly, asher, which is the standard way of saying that or which, in the north was she, which becomes the standard in modern Hebrew. But these are some minor, dialectal differences. They could have spoken to one another without a problem, no different than we can speak to our Canadian neighbors or to our British neighbors. I may never use the word lift or Laurie, but I certainly know what they're referring to when they use them because our dialects are mutually intelligible.
Thank you. Approximately when is the text of 2 Kings 18:19 that describes this event dated in the
Right.
Sennacherib siege?
So 2 Kings 18 and 19 is the story of Hezekiah and the siege of Jerusalem. Now, the book of Kings, I didn't mention this, always tells us that this excerpt comes from the annals of the kings of Judah or from the annals of the kings of Israel, depending which king. So we have to assume, or I assume, that those are authentic statements, that these stories would be based on annals that were kept by the kings in real time. Clearly, the Book of Kings receives its final editing in the Babylonian exile because it refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, and the last verse of the Book of Kings actually refers to the deposed king of Judah living in Babylon in captivity. So we know it takes its form in the 6th century, but it's all based on earlier authentic records, which must have been available to the author of Kings who digested the annals of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. I would say it's 8th century material, in the case of Hezekiah, very late 8th century material, digested through the 7th and 6th century lens. Can't say more than that.
So how did the exiles to Babylonia travel that long distance? By foot, by oxen pulled wagons, by horses? How did they protect infants and pregnant women?
Yeah, it's called war, and it's called the human casualties of war. Now, these people were alive, they weren't human casualties in that way, but we live in a world that we can see in so many places, where, I mean, is it 500,000 people in the Sudan have been displaced in the last 2 years, and 500,000 Syrians were displaced in the course of the 20-year civil war. I mean, this is what happens, and you just walk along long journeys, the children on the ox carts and so on. We don't have details about that, but something like that must be what occurred. Yeah.
So are the Samaritans descendants of Israelites who stayed in place and were not expelled to Assyria or did not seek refuge in Jerusalem?
A great question with a complicated answer. Let's bring everybody up to speed. The Samaritans are a small religious group still today. They are about 1,000 people living still in the area of Nablus, and they venerate the God of Israel on Mount Gerizim, which I showed you, not in Jerusalem. They have the same Torah as the Jews. I mean, there are hundreds of minor differences, but essentially the same Torah. So they are part of the house of Israel. They call themselves Beit Yisrael. They're part of the house of Israel. and follow everything the Torah says, the festivals, Shabbat, the dietary laws, circumcision, whatever Jews do, Samaritans do, except they don't venerate God in Jerusalem, they worship God in the north. They are most likely the combination of the handful of people in the northern kingdom who remained, who didn't flee to Judah and were not deported to Assyria, and probably with some reinforcements from people who returned at some point when the Persian emperor allowed people to return. The Jews go back to Jerusalem, the Samaritans go back to Samaria. So that's the best we can say. By the 5th century B.C.E., in the later biblical books, we have references to them. We see evidence of the Jews and the Samaritans, sometimes in with tensions between them because they differed over where God should be worshipped.
So a question from Kathy is what was the population of Jerusalem at the break up into two kingdoms?
Wouldn't it be wonderful to know? In other words, what was the
Yeah.
population of the Jerusalem at the time of David and Solomon is essentially what you're asking, right?
Mhm.
Um, People have done it, population estimates based on the built environment. How much livable space are there? A human being, how many humans into one of those small homes and so on. I think the answer is for the entire kingdom of David and Solomon, 100,000 people. So Jerusalem would have had what? 5,000 people, 10,000 people, something like that. By the time of Hezekiah, when it's that big, and by the time of, the destruction in 586, it might have been close to 100,000 people. But we have, 50, 60, 70,000 people, perhaps. Very hard to estimate populations.
I heard that the writing of the Hezekiah tunnel inscription suggests it might have been written by a refugee from Israel, suggesting that the educated refugees were doing manual labor in Judah. Is this true?
Well, since I co-authored the article on the subject, the answer is yes, of course it's true. This was an article that my colleague Bill Schneidewin from UCLA and I wrote, published about 10 years ago, I think. And yes, some of those northern dialectal features are to be found in the Hezekiah tunnel inscription. And the suggestion is, and Bill Schneidewin has just written an article by himself in Biblical Archaeology Review, for those of you who subscribe to BAR. So you can read it there. The suggestion is, okay, all these people have come into Jerusalem, doubling, trebling the size of the city. You need water, you build a tunnel by yourself. You do it. Here's the axes, here's the work, here's the engineer, but you're going to be the laborers to do it. And of course they did it, and it looks like they celebrate themselves with this inscription, which in fact does include a few northern dialectal features, right? So the answer is yes, it is true.
So a question is in the chat is what happened to the Jews who escaped to Egypt in 597 BC, I guess along the Jeremiah route?
Um, After they're referred to in the book of Jeremiah and maybe one or two other biblical books, but Jeremiah gives us a lot of information about them. They become the foundation of the Egyptian diasporic community. We have evidence of Jews in the far south at Elephantine in the 5th century. So this is the 6th century. We have Jews in Elephantine in the 5th century. We have Jews in the newly built Alexandria in the 4th and 3rd century. These would have been the first Jews in Egypt, and they remained there, and their descendants are informing the history of Jewish history. Alexandria becomes an extremely important topic for another lecture. Alexandria becomes an extremely important Jewish city in the Hellenistic period. Right, so these would have been their ancestors, the first Jews to come there in the 6th century BCE.
And I think we have time for one last question. And is the number of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers that's laid out in the Book of Kings realistic?
Oh, I don't think those numbers can be taken. You couldn't have had 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. And I showed the inscription, right? Sennacherib says he took away 200,000 people from Judah. Well, I just said the whole kingdom was maybe 100,000 people. Uh, Inflated numbers, and it remains an issue in biblical ancient Near Eastern scholarship. How do we deal with these inflated numbers? No good answers other than to say they're inflated.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Rendsburg. This is such an enlightening series of lectures. I think I speak for everyone here, and thanking you and sharing with you how much we learned from this. And there's a a roaring round of applause for you that you can't hear right now, but some of the people are putting it in the chat. So thank you so
I
much.
see some of those comments. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to be with the ASU community, which extends in the Zoom world beyond Phoenix.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Lisa.